Continuing our study of the general epistles, we turn in this lecture to the Petrine epistles, the Johannine epistles, and the little epistle of Jude. First, the Petrine epistles. As to authorship, 1 Peter was composed by Simon Peter through Silvanus, his amanuensis or secretary. 2 Peter is more problematic. Indeed, no other New Testament document has been more challenged as to its authorship than 2 Peter. This likely stems from the fact that 2 Peter and Jude share so much material in common. Some 19 of Jude's 25 verses are in 2 Peter. Now, whether that means literary dependence or reliance on a common source is a matter of much debate. In either case, mere similarity between 2 Peter and Jude is not sufficient reason to deny Petrine authorship of the former. Moreover, there are many correspondences, both in vocabulary and theology, between 1 and 2 Peter, strengthening the case that if Peter wrote 1 Peter, then there's no compelling reason to deny him authorship of the second letter as well. As to date, 1 Peter was almost certainly composed either during or more likely immediately preceding the Neronian persecution of the mid to late 60s. 2 Peter then would have been composed just prior to Peter's martyrdom sometime between AD 64 and 68. As to addressees and message, in 1 Peter, Christians in Rome are experiencing the run-up to the persecution at the hands of Nero, which began in Rome in AD 64. Peter writes to Christians, whether they are Jewish converts or Gentiles is a matter of debate, who live in Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey, who are already experiencing private local persecution in the form of social ostracism, bigotry, and oppression, and perhaps even some localized state persecution. And he writes to them to encourage them to remain strong and faithful amid the repercussions coming their way because of their faith. He reminds them of who they are, and more importantly, whose they are, that they are citizens of the kingdom of God, and that their true home lies there. Hence, they are to see themselves as resident aliens and exiles in a strange and hostile land. As such, they are to get along, to the degree possible, with their non-Christian neighbors, including their persecutors, but never to the point of forsaking their true identity and calling. 2 Peter lacks the specificity of 1 Peter, but if composed slightly after 1 Peter, then it was likely written with the same people and problems in mind. If one accepts Petrine authorship of 2 Peter and places the date of the letter near the end of Peter's life, then the most likely occasion for 2 Peter is that Peter was nearing the end and felt the need to address a false teaching menacing the churches, namely the denial of the parousia, the Greek word for the return or second coming of Christ. Because these false teachers denied the return of Christ and the final judgment, they advocated unrestrained freedom called antinomianism and libertine behavior. It is to refute this false teaching that 2 Peter appears to have been composed. The message of 2 Peter is to encourage believers to pursue Christian values and virtues in light of the coming of the day of the Lord, which, though delayed, is nonetheless inevitable. As to significance, 1 Peter is a profound exposition of the Christian faith from the point of view of the church's preeminent apostle. A chief contribution of the book is that it employs language that up to that time had been restricted to Israel, such as the chosen race, the royal priesthood, the holy nation, and applies that language to the church. See, for example, 1 Peter 2, 4 through 10. The significance of 2 Peter is its association of eschatology with ethics, because Christians believe that there is an end to this story we call history, and that history is finally his, that is God's story. Our behavior and conduct in advance of the end should be informed by that belief. Turning to the Johannine epistles, the Johannine letters are among 5 New Testament documents attributed to the Apostle John. 1 John especially favors apostolic authorship. The language and theology of 1 John recall that of the fourth gospel. Both employ dual imagery, light and dark, truth and falsehood, and so forth. Both make use of ideas such as abiding and love and world, and both affirm a high Christology. Though if the Gospel of John stresses that Jesus is the Son of God, 1 John stresses that it is Jesus who is the Son of God. That is, while the Gospel stresses Jesus' deity, the letter stresses Jesus' humanity, or more properly, the incarnation. A recent theory of authorship calls for brief mention. Raymond Brown, in his book Community of the Beloved Disciple, and his students have argued that the Johannine writings, including the fourth gospel and the Johannine epistles, are the product of what he calls a Johannine community of disciples of the Apostle John who apply his ideas and theology to changing circumstances in the life of the church. The argument is that the fourth gospel places such pronounced emphasis on high Christology, the deity of Christ, that it was misunderstood by some in the community to mean that the incarnate Jesus, that is, Jesus the man, could not have possibly been the divine Christ, resulting in this group breaking away and leaving the community altogether. Now, on this theory, the breakaway group was a group of nascent, docetic Gnostics. Full-blown Gnosticism did not emerge as a movement until the 2nd century. But these were proto-Gnostics who believed that the divine Christ only seemed. That is, the name given to them, they were docetic from the Greek dokeo, meaning to seem, that Christ only seemed to be human, thus denying the full humanity of Christ. The Johannine epistles, especially 1 John, so the argument goes, were written to correct this misunderstanding, hence its emphasis on the idea that the human Jesus was in fact the divine Christ. While the Johannine community theory was popular for a time, it has fallen into disfavor among some scholars, chiefly for its reliance on Gnosticism as the backdrop of the letter. This is problematic for two reasons. First, as I said, Gnosticism did not emerge as a Christian heresy until the 2nd century. And second, Jews, as easily as Christian heretics, might have left the community because they refused to believe that the crucified Jesus could have been the Messiah. On balance, then, it seems best to stay with the traditional view of apostolic authorship of the Johannine epistles. As to date, since 1 John presupposes the fourth gospel, a date sometime after the Gospel of John is demanded. Just how much after is debatable, though a date near the end of the 1st century appears likely. Regarding addressees, the letter appears to have been addressed to a congregation or congregations familiar to John in that he refers to them with intimate language. He calls them my little children and beloved. Given the strong tradition that John ended his days in Ephesus, see the church father Irenaeus' writings, it seems likely that the letters were addressed to churches in and around Ephesus. 2 John is addressed to the enigmatic, the elect lady and her children, and 3 John to a certain Gaius. Not much help, given the fact that that was a very common Roman name at the time. As to message, apparently a group has left the congregation because of a disagreement so fundamental that it made continuing participation in the community problematic. These secessionists appear to have rejected the notion that the human Jesus was in fact the Christ. See, for example, 1 John chapter 4, verses 1 through 6. While the theories abound as to the identity of the secessionists, the most common theory is that they were nascent or early Gnostics, full-blown Gnosticism not emerging until the 2nd century, who denied the incarnation and instead affirmed a spiritual Christ. Moreover, they appear to have believed that if one is joined in spirit to this spiritual Christ, one can do as one pleases with one's body. Gnosticism, a Christian heresy, advocated a spirit-body dualism, stressing the former, disparaging the latter. Consequently, Gnostics tended to respond in one of two ways: asceticism, which denied things to the body such as food, water, and sexual gratification, and libertinism, which went the opposite way and indulged the body and its desires, since the body was of no importance anyway. The nascent Gnostics First John addresses appear to have done the latter. That is, they were libertines. John therefore advocates for integrity in Christian living, both body and spirit. Second and Third John are proper letters addressing situations in a local congregation or congregations. As to significance, some have suggested that First John was made necessary by a misunderstanding and misinterpretation of the Gospel of John. That is, some interpreted the very high Christology of the fourth Gospel to mean a Gnostic-like disparagement of the corporeal and physical character of the Christian life. True or not, the Johannine epistles do reflect an extension of the same thought and theological expression found in the Gospel of John. Turning to the Epistle of Jude, Jude claims to have been composed by Judas, brother of James. The appellation is noteworthy for two reasons. First, it is unusual that a person of that time would identify himself by his brother rather than his father. The normal designation was son of. Apparently, the author deemed his association with his brother to be more indicative and significant than his association with his father. Second, the only James in the New Testament that does not require a further designator, such as son of Zebedee, for example, is James, the half-brother of Jesus and the author of the Epistle of James. See, for example, Matthew chapter 13, verse 55. For both of these reasons, the author of the Epistle of Jude is most likely Jude, Judas, brother of James, half-brother of Jesus. As to date, fixing the date of Jude is more problematic since we have no specific and reliable information about Jude's death. Moreover, the date of Jude depends in part on its relationship with 2 Peter, the two letters sharing several parallels, both in thought and language, parallels so close that it seems likely that one was used as a source for the other. A detailed analysis of both letters suggests that it is 2 Peter that utilized Jude rather than the reverse. If this is so, then Jude was composed before 2 Peter. If, as we have suggested, 2 Peter was composed shortly before Peter's death around AD 64 during the persecution of Emperor Nero, then Jude must have been composed sometime earlier. But how much earlier is difficult to say with any confidence. When it comes to its message, Jude, as was the case with 2 Peter, was composed to address a threat to the Christian congregations created by a group of false teachers who minimized eschatology and ethics in favor of an emphasis on the freedom of the Christian life, interpreted to mean that Christians had been liberated from all constraints of living a circumspect life. As an aside, perhaps you see a pattern here among the later letters of the New Testament, namely that a misinterpretation of some of Paul's writings has led to the erroneous belief that because one is saved by grace, one can do as one pleases. The central message of Jude is to rally Christians in the face of false teaching to contend for the faith once entrusted to the saints. When it comes to its significance, Jude is important because it is one of the few places in the New Testament where Jewish apocryphal literature, the Assumption of Moses and First Enoch, is cited as authoritative, suggesting that the canon of authoritative scripture was still in flux when Jude was composed. These quotations from the Jewish Apocrypha in Jude also argue for the priority of Jude over 2 Peter. As we have already pointed out, there are numerous parallels between Jude and 2 Peter, suggesting a literary connection between the two letters. However, these quotations from the Jewish Apocrypha are absent in 2 Peter. Hence, it is more likely that 2 Peter, having Jude as a source, omitted these extra-canonical quotations than that Jude, Having 2 Peter as a source added them.